The bus stop was quiet, in the way only early winter mornings could be, when the sky looked tired and the city hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to wake up or not, and people stood wrapped in coats and private worries, pretending not to notice one another, except for one man who stood slightly apart, his jacket thin, his shoes cracked at the soles, his beard untrimmed, but his eyes unusually gentle for someone the world had forgotten. A homeless man known around the area as Daniel, though most people never bothered to ask his name. And as he watched the bus approach in the distance, he noticed a woman a few steps away, patting her coat pockets again and again, her face tightening with every failed search, panic blooming in her eyes as she whispered to herself that she must have dropped her purse, because when the bus hissed to a stop and the driver opened the door with impatience already written on his face, she stepped forward, hands trembling, and admitted she didn't have enough money for the fare, and the driver sighed loudly, shaking his head, already prepared to wave her away like an inconvenience, while the other passengers stared straight ahead, suddenly fascinated by the pavement. And it was then that Daniel reached into his pocket, feeling the familiar emptiness where money rarely stayed long, pulling out 2 crumpled bills he had saved from the previous night when someone had given him spare change, money he had planned to use for soup later, and without hesitation he stepped forward, held out the bills and said softly, "I've got it." And the woman turned to him, surprise flashing across her face as she took in his worn clothes and tired posture, her pride flaring for a second before something warmer replaced it, gratitude mixed with disbelief. And she tried to refuse, insisting he needed it more, but Daniel only smiled, a small, steady smile that came from a place deeper than circumstance, and said, "Kindness isn't about who needs it more. It's about who can give it right now." And the driver took the money without comment. The woman stepped onto the bus, and as she sat down, still shaken, she glanced back through the glass to see Daniel already turning away, as if the moment had meant nothing. But for her, it meant everything, because she had woken that morning burdened by stress, a delayed meeting, a missing purse, and a life she felt was spiraling out of her control. And that single unexpected act cracked something open inside her. And as the bus pulled away, she promised herself she would find him again, not knowing that this man who had just paid her bus fare slept under bridges and relied on shelters, or that she herself was Clara Whitmore, one of the most successful real estate investors in the city, a woman who owned dozens of properties, closed million-dollar deals before lunch, and yet, in that quiet moment on a bus filled with strangers, felt smaller and more human than she had in years. And as Daniel walked back toward the alley where he spent his nights, stomach already growling but heart strangely light, neither of them could imagine how that single choice, that single dollar handed over without expectation, would tie their lives together in a way that would change both of them forever. And if you believe even small kindnesses can reshape destinies, then stay with this story and make sure you subscribe, because what happens next will remind you why humanity still matters. Clara didn't forget the man at the bus stop, not when she reached her office, not during the tense meeting she barely made it to, and not even when her assistant returned her missing purse later that day, explaining it had been left in a cafe, because all Clara could think about was the quiet dignity in Daniel's voice and the way he gave without calculation. And by evening, she was back at the same bus stop, scanning every face, asking shopkeepers, and finally learning about the homeless man who slept nearby. And when she found him sitting on a cardboard mat, sharing bread with a stray dog, she didn't approach as a savior, but as a person, sitting beside him, returning his money with interest and more, listening to his story of job loss, medical bills, and the slow slide into invisibility. And instead of offering a handout, she offered opportunity, helping him get documentation, medical care, and temporary housing, then surprising him weeks later with a job maintaining one of her properties, something stable, something dignified. And as months passed, Daniel changed, not just in appearance but in posture, confidence and hope, while Clara changed too, choosing to invest in people instead of just buildings, creating programs to employ the homeless, using her wealth not as a shield, but as a bridge. And 1 year later, at a small ceremony, opening a new housing project designed to help people like Daniel transition back into society, Clara told the crowd the story of a homeless man who once paid her bus fare, crediting him for reminding her what real wealth looked like. While Daniel stood there, clean-shaven, employed and reunited with family, tears in his eyes as he realized that kindness, when given freely, always finds its way back multiplied. And if this story moved you even a little, remember to subscribe to the channel, because stories like these aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that the smallest acts of goodness can change lives in ways we never expect. Days turned into weeks after Clara first returned to the bus stop, and though she found Daniel that same evening, the real transformation began slowly, in quiet moments that never make headlines. Moments where trust is built not with promises, but with consistency. As Clara showed up again and again, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just conversation, learning that Daniel had once been a skilled carpenter with a steady job, a small apartment, and a wife who passed away after a long illness that drained his savings and broke his spirit, and as he spoke, his voice never carried bitterness, only regret and responsibility, which struck Clara harder than any accusation could have, because she realized how close anyone could be to losing everything, including herself. And so instead of offering a quick fix, she offered structure, helping Daniel replace lost documents, accompanying him to clinics, introducing him to a social worker she personally funded. And when Daniel finally stood inside a modest room of his own for the first time in years, with a real bed and a locked door, he cried silently, overwhelmed not by luxury but by dignity, while Clara watched from the doorway, understanding that this was the greatest investment she had ever made. And as Daniel regained strength and confidence, Clara offered him work at one of her older properties. Not charity, but honest labor, trusting his skills before he fully trusted himself. And Daniel worked harder than anyone, arriving early, staying late, fixing things others ignored, and slowly the tenants began to notice the quiet man who listened, who treated their homes with respect, and who smiled the same way he had at the bus stop. And months later, when Clara reviewed reports showing reduced costs and happier residents, she smiled, realizing kindness had created efficiency no spreadsheet ever could. And as Daniel saved his earnings, reconnected with his estranged daughter who thought he had vanished forever, and stood in front of a mirror one morning, barely recognizing the man looking back, he understood that the bus fare he had given away had somehow returned to him as a life, restored, while Clara, inspired by him, launched a new initiative within her company, turning unused properties into transitional housing, employing people who had been invisible for too long. And when journalists asked her why she did it, she told them about a homeless man who paid her bus fare without knowing who she was, reminding her that character shows itself most clearly when there's nothing to gain. And at the opening of the first housing center, Clara invited Daniel to stand beside her, not as a symbol but as a partner. And when she handed him a set of keys, not just to an apartment, but to a supervisory role managing the very program that saved him, the crowd erupted, and Daniel, voice shaking, said that he once thought kindness was something people gave until they ran out. But now he knew it multiplied when shared. And as the camera panned across faces filled with hope, Clara ended her speech by saying that wealth doesn't change who we are. It reveals us, and if a man with nothing could give everything he had, then all of us could give a little more. And if this story touched your heart, inspired your faith in humanity, or reminded you that small acts matter, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because every story shared here proves that kindness is never wasted. It's only waiting to come back around.